Hey folks, hey folks, hey folks, hey folks. All right, let me get into some of your questions. I'm going to jump into things today. Really interesting week that we have had here. Let me start with a bunch of questions and try and pull them together. Hey everybody. First, my apologies for missing Tuesday and not actually posting something in my place of the usual politics chat, or at least telling you I wasn't going to be here. What happened was entirely my fault. I forgot simply because I was in New York City, and the reason I was there was because I was interviewing one of my true academic heroes, one of my great mentors, and I was very, very nervous about it. So I wanted to make sure I got it all right, and I was totally prepped and so on and so forth. But we had planned meetings for that whole day. So I was in and out of meetings as well. And of course, they always ran over. At the same time that we had both the meeting of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and President Donald Trump in front of the assembled military advisors and the shutdown. And I just got overwhelmed and I just totally forgot about it. And many thanks to Kristen, who wrote to me. I was actually backstage when we were about to do this event, and she wrote and said, people are worried about you. Are you okay? And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm fine. I mean, I'm really nervous, but I'm fine. And then I thought, I forgot politics chat. So I'm really sorry about that. I was just completely overwhelmed. Anyway, so here we are with Minneapolis and Boise, Idaho, nice town. Millsboro, Delaware. I'm terribly sorry about Tuesday. Keene, New Hampshire. California. Lacey, Washington. State Road, North Carolina. Oh, I like that town name. Montreal. I told you I'm reading this biography of Champlain, so I'm reading a lot about Canada and its early days right now. More Canada, San Diego, and I believe we just saw somebody who went by from New York with the name of one of New York's great Cortland apples. It's about time to have that here. So welcome, and let me get into some of the questions you asked because people seem very nervous, and I think maybe I can talk you a little bit off the ledge. At the same time, I warn you, your fears are not entirely unfounded. So let me start. Excuse me. Let me start with. By the way, I know I look like a hobbit. It's cold here, and I, as you know, I'm in somebody else's place, so I don't want to turn the heat on yet. I'm sure it'll be okay when I really need it. But so let's start with Tuesday and what happened with the assembled 800 or so of the nation's top military advisors, both from the Army and from the other branches as well. And what was going on with that? Because there was a lot of alarm when Defense Secretary, and it is Defense Secretary, not Secretary of War. I think I might have said this to you before, although the administration has said that it wants to change that name, and I've talked about that before. That has to go through Congress. So it is still legally the Department of Defense. Anyway, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called a meeting very, very quickly for all these top advisors and top military officials to come in from all over the world from their assignments to the Marine base at Quantico, Virginia, on, as I say, very short notice. I think it was 4 days, pulling them off ships, pulling them from their missions and so on, along with their top enlisted advisors. And many people were extremely concerned about that because it coincided with what looked like and turned out to be a government shutdown. What were they up to? Now, before I go into how that played out, I want to make the point that I don't think we make enough in the United States, and that's that the job of the government, of any government, before it does anything else, the job is to keep the nation safe, safe from invasion, safe from attack. It is to keep the people safe. Now, in the United States, our land base has largely been safe since World War II. So people tend to forget that the military actually has a job. It's not just part of some international chess game, that in fact it has a minute-by-minute job of keeping the United States safe. So pulling all these people to one specific place and making it public in that manner was really dangerous and highly I mean, unprecedented. Nobody does that, or nobody did it until Secretary Hegseth did it last week. So people were justifiably very concerned about whether there was going to be a new policy or what was going to happen at that event. And the first day when he first called everyone together, there was a lot of rumors circling around, and what were they going to do, and was it going to be like, other authoritarian regimes where they kill everybody, or was it going to be a loyalty oath, or was it going to be whatever? Well, news started to drop pretty quickly that this was going to be a talk about the warrior ethos. And I'll be frank, I did not think that that was correct, that there had to be something bigger than that. And in fact, what we saw was on Tuesday was the Secretary of Defense haranguing professionals who are highly trained and incredibly qualified and true professionals, with the idea that the military has to be reworked along some kind of hyper white Christian nationality in order to be truly lethal. And that was deeply problematic, not only because every possible study will tell you the opposite is true, but also because Hegseth was in the military fairly briefly, rose to the rank of a major, but his job before he came to the head of the Pentagon was he was a weekend host on the Fox News channel. So he looked the part of a military advisor to President Donald Trump, but he doesn't have the experience. He is not a career military person, and all the things that one could say about him. So watching him lecture these professionals was deeply embarrassingly painful for those of us who understand the difference between those two things. Now, there was a couple ways that mattered. First of all is that lots of people talk about whether the military will hold if Trump tries to weaponize them. And I think if you watched that speech, what you saw was professionals. And what really jumped out to me is that um, I talk a lot about the history of the military, which is different, adjacent, but different than the history of the United States. And a lot of people make the mistake of taking a look at them and assuming that they are partisan. And I have never served in the military, and I could be entirely wrong in what I'm about to observe. But what I saw was something that reminded me a lot of myself. That is, when I look at the world, I look at the larger stream of American history. There are presidents I like, there are presidents I dislike, there are presidents I support, there are presidents I don't support. But to me, they are all transient. That is, they're going to be here, they're going to go away. And my loyalty is to the much larger stream of American history. And I get kind of salty when people accuse me of being a shill, either for the Republicans or the Democrats. People accuse me on both sides, because while I certainly like and dislike different things, I just don't even think that way. And that's what I saw in that military. Those are leaders who are loyal to the institution of the U.S. military and its role in defending the United States of America. That's really different than partisanship. Even if they vote for a Republican or vote for a Democrat, it's a different way of looking at things. And it's important to remember that in the past, when you have seen military figures supporting Donald Trump, they have not been the senior people. They have been much more junior people. And the military frowns on that. That's absolutely not acceptable among the military. So what I saw was a number of extremely qualified people looking at somebody who is not going to be there forever and really recognizing how outlandish what he was saying was. Okay, that matters because the next person to speak was Donald Trump, who spoke for 70 minutes, give or take, and you can find the transcripts online. But he spoke in a way that was deeply, deeply, deeply unhinged. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I want to work in another question that people asked about the military. And you've said, is Donald Trump going to do what he suggested in that speech, which was use the military against American citizens? And the answer to that is I don't know. First of all, I don't know. I never know what's going to happen in the future, but I want to change the direction of your vision a little bit and recognize, as I keep saying, all of the branches of the military are covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. That's the 1878 law that says that the military cannot be used as a law enforcement entity against American citizens. And someday I'm actually going to write down the history of the Posse Comitatus Act, because it's a little bit different than people know. And I think I've talked about it here before. But the exception to what I just said, the military is covered by the Posse Comitatus Act, but the Department of Homeland Security is not. The Department of Homeland Security is a very new department in the United States. And in fact, we want its officers generally to enforce the law. And what I mean by that is, within the Department of Homeland Security, we have our coasties, the United States Coast Guard. And anybody who lives on the coast is a huge fan of the Coast Guard. I mean, I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody, but there's a reason we call them our coasties. They enforce the law on the coastline, and they rescue people who get into trouble. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security. We need them to enforce those laws. There are also other law enforcement organizations within the Department of Homeland Security that we want to have enforcing the law. People like the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and I think it's explosive devices. I never remember what that last piece is. Anyway, they are not covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. And one of the things that people keep confusing is they keep talking about how Trump is deploying the military in the streets. And yes, there have been federalized National Guard troops and Marines in Los Angeles. There are federalized National Guard troops now in Memphis. There have been federalized National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., and there are now 200 federalized National Guard troops going into Portland, Oregon. That's all true. But the people who are cracking heads right now all across the country are part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're members of either the Border Patrol or of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Those people are the ones who are doing these extraordinary warrantless sweeps that happened on Tuesday in Chicago, in which they simply went door to door on a 5-story apartment building on the South Shore and took everybody out except one guy who had double barred his door and went back to bed. That man can sleep through anything, apparently. Took them all out and put them in zip ties, including, men, women, children, some of whom were naked, held them outside for hours, ended up arresting 37 of them, or detaining 37 of them, and telling everybody else they could go. There were American citizens in that group. And again, this is being challenged right now in court as a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, part of our Bill of Rights, which protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures. But when you talk about fears of declaring martial law, Trump is doing this without declaring martial law. This is ICE doing it. And ICE has a huge budget, and they are detaining people. They are detaining American citizens. This is a huge, huge deal. And it's getting local attention, and it's getting some national attention, but not nearly enough national attention, because when it does get attention, as in the case in New York, where an ICE agent took a young woman and threw her against a wall into the floor, ICE has to back off a little bit. So before you worry too much about martial law, which, by the way, is not Marshall like James Marshall Hendricks, Marshall. It's Marshall like as in war, Martial, like the god Mars, the god of war. That is certainly something that the administration is playing with, and it's playing with it. We saw in a declaration today that the U.S. is at war with drug cartels, although the administration did not spell out what it meant by drug cartels, and most legal analysts are saying this is just simply not going to hold water. It is dancing around that issue because that would give the president really quite large powers, but it doesn't need that to cause extraordinary havoc among our neighbors. So before you worry too much about that coming, ICE is already here, and ICE is already detaining US citizens as well as undocumented immigrants, as well as immigrants who are here lawfully, whose status sometimes changes because of the changes the administration is making, and are detaining people that they claim are criminals. But we all know at this point they're trying to fill their quotas by taking anybody who might have any kind of, warrant or anything in their past, any kind of blemish in their past that enables them to add them to their quotas. So before you worry too much about martial law, remember that ICE is already here, and ICE is already incredibly damaging to the social fabric and to this country. All right, so part of that you asked, where are the detainees that ICE has gathered? And I want to reemphasize here, as I keep doing, the administration is making it very, very, very difficult to figure out what they're doing by simply refusing to release any information about anything. So we know that people are disappearing into the system, and we don't know how or when they come out. There are people who track what appear to be ICE flights to other countries. We don't know the names of the people on those flights. And this, people ask a lot about the detainees who appear to have disappeared from the detention center in the Florida Everglades, whose nickname I refuse to use. Those people, there are all kinds of concern about what has happened to those people. It's just entirely possible that they have been rendered to another country, that they have been deported, that they are in different detention facilities, that those records are not accessible to people who are trying to find that out, including family members. It does not necessarily, I shouldn't say necessarily, it probably does not mean that they have been unalived, but that they have um, been hidden somewhere, moved somewhere, rendered somewhere, pushed out of the United States into a place where their lives are certainly unstable. But just to lay a little bit of comfort, perhaps anyway, over that. I'm not going to dig too much more into that, but I do want to point out how much what is happening in the United States right now looks like Reconstruction. That is the period in the United States after the Civil War in which a very small group of reactionary white Southerners used terror, which is what the ICE sweeps are designed to do, to gain political control over the American South for 80 years. And the key thing that we have today that Reconstruction era Americans did not have is the ability to communicate with each other, and the ability to post videos, and the ability to call this stuff out in real time when the administration says, for example, over that ICE raid in Chicago, that they arrested people who were members of a gang. We have the ability to say, as people did almost instantly, you have no evidence of that. You have not produced any evidence of that. And until you do, we're going to have to assume you just did a random sweep of these people. All right. So now here's the other story of what it matters between the beginning of this week and now. And that is, I got to laugh here. Somebody has just called me an uninformed communist, which, you know, come on, really? It just, you know, clearly you have no concept of what a communist is or what it means to be uninformed, except, oh, it appears you're uninformed. Sorry, couldn't resist. I'll stop. The other thing that was important about what happened on Tuesday was that Trump, as I say, was not well. He was not well in that speech. And that's not just me talking. I'm going to give you more information about that in a minute. But he was rambling. He was really unable to be coherent. At times he seemed to be reading off a teleprompter, but then he would free associate. And he was treating this meeting as if it were a rally of some sort. Although even his rallies used to be more organized than that, mentally organized than that. But it was not a rally. It was a meeting of the United States military brass, the people who are most responsible for keeping us safe. And what it did by live streaming it was it demonstrated to the world, not just to the United States and not just to military officials, that the president of the United States is not mentally competent. And that's That's a really, really big problem. And I want you to listen to something. I pulled this from his 70-minute speech, which he started to talk about Joe Biden, who, by the way, he mentioned, I think, was 11 times in that speech, which is highly unusual. But he said, they looked at him falling downstairs every day. Every day, the guy is falling downstairs, which is, Biden was riding a bike. He's still in really good physical shape. And then he said, I'm very careful. When I walk downstairs for like a month, stairs like these stairs, I walk very slowly. Listen to this. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became a part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down, but don't pop down the stairs. And then he free associated about Obama. Listen to what I just read. Doesn't it sound like medical advice? To me, it just really jumped out that he was repeating what a doctor had said to him. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down. I thought that really jumped out in that speech, an admission that there was something physically, at the very least, and I would say mentally, that was certainly on the mind of Trump and possibly of his medical advisors. Now, he did a couple of other things on Tuesday that people didn't necessarily put in the context of Tuesday and probably should have. One is that, remember, it was the day that the shutdown was about to happen, and the Democrats have said they would not give the Republicans cover for the budget reconciliation bill they passed in July. Remember that? That was the budget reconciliation bill that could have everything, but including the kitchen sink, which it did, because it only needed Republican votes to pass. Budget reconciliation bills, there are a number of bills, very few, but two, I think it is, bills every year that can go through Congress without having to face a filibuster in the Senate. And someday I'll do a whole nother thing on the filibuster. But one of those is a budget reconciliation bill. So the Republicans needed no Democratic votes to pass that, and they just went for it. They went for broke. They got everything they wanted. They got a major tax cut for extension of the 2017 tax cut for the wealthy and corporations. They got slashing Medicare, Medicaid, which also is going to involve cuts to Medicare. They got cuts to the supplemental nutrition program. They got cuts to energy, green energy programs, and so on. But one of the things that they appear to have overlooked, because this was done very hastily and it was a huge, huge measure. One of the things they did was they did not extend the premium tax credits. The premium tax credits are subsidies for purchasing healthcare insurance on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. With those expiring at the end of the year, people's insurance rates are going to skyrocket, and they're going to skyrocket enough that healthy Americans are almost certainly going to drop their ACA coverage, meaning they'll be uninsured. But that also means, which is bad enough, but that also about 4.2 million are estimated to be people who will drop off. But that also means that for those who remain on the ACA markets, the premiums are going to go up because the healthiest population just said, we can't afford this, we're out. And that means that the population covered by those markets will be sicker and older and cost more to insure. So you're already seeing premiums skyrocketing. The numbers started coming out on October 1st. The Republicans desperately want the Democrats to own a piece of that. And voting for this extension until November 21st would make the Democrats, put the Democrats at least a little bit on the hook for saying, okay, we can live with what the Republicans did in what they are calling the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The Democrats call it the Big Ugly Bill. But so the Republicans know this is a losing issue. So they keep saying, Democrats want $1.5 trillion dollars for, I think it's trillion, it might be billion. I think it's trillion. I don't know. Sorry, I don't do numbers well. They keep saying that that the Democrats are simply trying to get health care for undocumented immigrants, which is simply not true. You know, they've got, and then Trump started saying they want trans athletes and throwing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with this actual fight and have a lot to do with Trump's usual rallying cries, which just don't have a lot of teeth anymore. So on Tuesday, Trump actually came out and he said, this shutdown is going to let us cut a lot of the things that they want. And by they, he meant Democrats. But he went on to say medical stuff, benefits, you know, the sorts of things that actually all Americans like. And so he did this. And then it was like all of a sudden he caught himself and he said, I mean, we don't want to do that. We're just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, even though we know that, in fact, the DOGE cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency did not do anything to address waste, fraud, and abuse. But so he did that, and that was on Tuesday. And I have not been madly online today. I've actually been writing, but Trump has not appeared in public since Tuesday, I don't believe. Instead, what you are seeing is him posting on social media deep fake videos, really offensive stuff, and seemingly staying off the stage, which is really interesting because you don't know what he's going to say next. So his handlers clearly do not want him in public. They want to use him to troll people, but they don't seem to want him out there. Now, one of the things that he has done since then in his posting is talked about the power of Russell Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, to cut all kinds of things that you could never cut if you actually had to go through Congress. Well, no, he can't do that. That's illegal. Doesn't matter. Russ Vought is trying to do it anyway. But that matters because today he said he's going to have this meeting with Vought, and who's the author of Project 2025, and they're going to see what they can cut. Well, the reason that matters is because if you remember in summer 2024, before the election, when Project 2025 began to get attention, people like me read Project 2025 and said, this is a Christian nationalist fantasy about destroying the modern US government and replacing it with a theocracy. And when people started to learn about Project 2025, the polls said that only about 4% of Americans wanted it to go into place. Well, of course, and in fact, when people talked about Project 2025, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Trump said, I have nothing to do with that. I got nothing to do with it. I don't know about it. And they fired one of the key people who had said he was working with Trump. And the legacy media picked that up, and both sides the issues. Oh, well, you know, when at one point there's a famous video now where Harris said Project 2025, and the interviewer said, Trump says he's not part of that. And Harris is like, come on. Well, now we know that he is, in fact, putting that into place. The people around him are putting it into place. But that being said, he hasn't publicly admitted it yet. Today, he publicly admitted it. You know, the great Russell Vought is part of Project 2025. And that is not going to make it any more popular to link the government shutdown to Project 2025 and basically openly admitting that Trump lied. All right, so if you listen to the people around Trump right now, look at the fact that he's saying this off-the-wall stuff in public, posting deep fakes that are deeply offensive, admitting that he was in on Project 2025. I mean, he's really kind of self-destructing. But watch J.D. Vance, because the next person in line, if Trump goes somewhere, is J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance is a master of knifing somebody in the back while pretending to be on their side. So he was asked in public, again, he's the face of the administration these last couple of days, about Trump's deep fakes and altered videos that he is posting about people like Hakeem Jeffries. And he could have passed it off quickly. Instead, he dug in a way that made Trump look really bad by saying, "You know, it's funny. This is funny that he's doing this, and, you know, this is a way to lighten up," and, you know, and really spent some time implying that Trump was not recognizing the gravity of a government shutdown, which is a very grave thing. And then there is circulating a clip of House Speaker Mike Johnson being confronted by a Democratic lawmaker who's like, and I'm not quoting, "Dude, your president is unhinged. We got a real problem here." And Johnson said, "You have people on your side," and again, this is not a quote, "You have people like that too, also." Listen to that. In fact, the Democrats do not have people in the presidency or even high up in their ranks who are unhinged and have that kind of power. But but Johnson didn't say he's fine. He said, "You have people like that too," saying, "Yeah, I know he's crazy." And then he said, "I didn't watch the speech." Which is unbelievable. This is one of the most important events in his tenure, right? That all these military leaders have been called back to Washington, and he says he didn't watch the speech. That's it's not it is it doesn't pass the smell test. Even if you didn't watch it, you should have read it. And you know, they're clearly trying to get away from this, but they're not getting away from it in such a way that they are supporting Trump anymore. And today, the Politico reported that a number of Republicans are really nervous about what the administration is doing with its very clear claims to be hitting Democrats during this shutdown through things like ending the funding for infrastructure projects in New York City, which is badly going to hurt Republicans in the state of New York, not just the Democrats who are who voted against the continuing resolution. So, for all that there is this real power grab going on, there is also, I think, a really unstable underground to it, an unstable feeling about the president. And you have seen it with open calls from people like J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, to invoke the 25th Amendment. Now, don't hold your breath on that one, but this is not a stable situation. This is not a rising dictatorship that has everything in its control by any stretch of the imagination. It's not to say they're not doing dangerous, damaging things, but to recognize that there is also this real instability within the administration. That's about as much time as I have on that, because I want to go to the next point that people asked about and that is important to make, and that is, you know, somebody said, "How come everything is illegal, but there's nothing we can do about it?" And first of all, we are doing things about it. But second of all, I got to put the blame here where it belongs, and that is on Trump's Republican enablers. The system was set up for, especially the Republican, especially the Senate, to care more about the country than they do about their party. And Donald Trump should have been convicted of the charges on which he was impeached in 2020 and again in 2021. And they let him go because they wanted to have partisan advantage. They could shut this down whenever they wanted to. And the huge irony of this is that if they did, if the Republicans really began to jump ship, the people who do that would build themselves extraordinary careers and places in the history books. So far, they are refusing to do it, and it is an extraordinary dereliction of duty that I feel very keenly, because they are destroying our system of government. So we're not able to count on them, which is where the framers of the Constitution put the responsibility for protecting Americans against the rise of a dictator. They're punting. They're refusing to do it. They're waiting for somebody to take over. This is absolutely inexcusable. inexcusable. I'm sorry, speaking of taking a look at the longer pattern of history here, this is the one in this moment that really jumps out. But if senators in Congress and representatives in Congress are refusing to act, the courts are holding. The lower courts are holding, not not the Supreme Court, but the lower courts are holding, and they're pushing back, and they're stopping the administration in every possible different way. And that matters because it slows the march of authoritarianism. It makes it more difficult. It muddies the waters in really important ways. And that matters. And the lawyers who are standing against them matter. But so too do Americans who are standing up against the suppression of free speech, for example. The reinstatement of Jimmy Kimmel on into his show Jimmy Kimmel Live mattered because what it said was that the administration cannot simply stifle language that it doesn't want. And crucially, even though Sinclair and I think it was Nexstar tried to suppress Jimmy Kimmel's show from local channels, what individuals did was they watched those shows, figured out who the advertisers were on them, and called them and said they were going to boycott. That forced those private organizations, those companies, I'm sorry, to back down. And that was a real triumph. It was a real triumph because it illustrated that this march toward authoritarianism is not going to go unchallenged. And the people who are doing that, speaking up and pushing back, are really important in this moment. So how can you do that? How can you push back? I want to emphasize something that sometimes I think we underemphasize because we're focused on 2026, and that is there is an election next month, and there are 52,000 races on the ballot next month in the United States of America. School board races, town offices, state races, and national and gubernatorial races. And there's a couple of those to call out. Somebody has asked me to call out, and that is Virginia, where Abigail Spanberger is running for the Virginia governorship. And that really matters in this moment, not least because so many of the fired or furloughed federal employees live in Virginia. That is one to turn out for, and the other is in New Jersey. And this I feel kind of personally, more than a little bit personally. I don't know anybody involved. But a friend of the Republican candidate got the National Records and Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, to hand over all of Democrat Mikey Sherrill's information that should have been redacted to that campaign so they could try to smear her. And that's just so foul. And then they blamed the person who had handed over the records, a member of the National Archives and Records Administration. That's where I get involved. NARA is vital to what people like me do. And as I say, I don't know any of the individuals involved, but keep your hands off my archives. Keep your hands off our records when you're trying to smear a political opponent. So Mikey Sherrill is actually running pretty neck and neck with her opponent. That's one really to show up for, because you can't reward that kind of sleaziness and weaponization, even of our records. She's a veteran. And what they were trying to do was, she was in a military academy during a major cheating scandal. She did not participate in the cheating scandal, but she did not snitch on the people who did. And because of that, she didn't walk with her class. But she was never implicated in any way and has had a blameless career. And yet her opponent has said he was horrified that she was implicated in that scandal, implying that she had cheated. She had not. That's just so freaking sleazy. Anyway, there are those two, but there are also 52,000 other races. And most of them, especially at the local level, will be determined by turnout. So if you're looking for something to do in the next month and use all your anxiety, work for those people in your communities and your states who are trying to protect democracy. That's what this election, that's what our era is about. You may not agree with them on anything else, but if they are trying to protect democracy rather than trying to protect the MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump, they're your girls and boys. Turn out for them. That's going to be really important. But here's another thing to do as in this moment. And I started talking about Reconstruction, and I want to come back to that because the reason that the reactionary former Confederates managed to take control of the American South was because they controlled the media. That's a long story that someday I'll write up, but they were the ones who told the stories. So, for example, a terrible massacre of Black Americans in 1873, known as the Colfax Massacre, in which more than 150 Black Americans died and 3 white Americans died, was written up in the papers as a riot by Black Americans. And that's the way it went into people's consciousness. We have the option of writing the history ourselves and making sure we call out these ICE raids and that we call out the things that are happening in our communities that are making us less safe. The loss of navigational buoys, for example, big around here. We have the option of doing that. And even if you don't want to be involved in other ways, film what's going on, keep a record. And if you don't want to do that, go to school board meetings where people are saying hateful things and stand behind the people who are speaking up against them. Just physically being there, offering your support, even without speaking, matters. It shows that you care about American democracy and the tenets of American democracy. And this is our moment to do those sorts of things. Now, I have to put in a plug here, not only for the visibility brigades that are taking place over overpasses, on overpasses, holding up signs. Those are really effective, spreading a lot of messages. For the card campaigns like I advertise on my Facebook page, the card campaign, there are other local ones, especially in Georgia, that enable us to get information out to places that might not otherwise see it. In bathrooms, for example, in areas of the country that are not necessarily getting good news, they're getting fake news from right-wing channels. Those are worth paying attention to and participating in. Organizing. And also on October 18th, we have another No King's Day. And that demonstration that we do not support the loss of our democracy is really important. It needs to be nonviolent. It needs to be cheerful and joyful. And it needs to reinforce the values of American democracy. And I can't emphasize enough that this is not a partisan moment for our country. You're going to find yourself making common cause with people that you do not agree with on a lot of stuff. We can hash that out on the other side of saving our democracy. And in fact, some of the issues that matter a lot to you right now might not matter at all on the other side of this, because the whole country will have changed. In this moment, we need everybody who cares about democracy to recognize that our moment is about we the people standing up against those who would turn us into a dictatorship, into an autocracy, into an oligarchy, into a monarchy. And in this, Americans have great experience from the time of our revolution, through the Civil War, through the late 1890s, when it looked like we would lose our democracy to the robber barons, through the 1930s, when it looked like we would lose it to a new corporate culture. We know how to make coalitions and stand up against those who are trying to turn us all into a system of serfs, essentially, who don't have a say in our government. And this is our moment to do that, because those people trying to destroy our democracy are fundamentally weak. If you looked at Pete Hegseth at that speech he gave, what you saw was not somebody who truly had power, but somebody who wanted to act as if he had power in the face of true professionals. And it's going to be important to remember that they're cosplaying a lot of what they don't have. And we have to remember that they're acting as if they have power that they don't have, and take that power back for we the people. Okay, so I gave you more on that than I normally do, because I'm sorry about Tuesday, and I will I will be around. I think I'm doing an interview with somebody cool tomorrow. I've got a lot of really cool interviews lined up, and I'll be writing as normal and be back on Tuesday for real. And if anything big happens, I'll be back with Joanne on Saturday morning, and if anything big happens in going forward, I'll hop back on real quickly just to do some short information about it. I hope that was useful, and I'll go back to finishing tonight's letter. Thanks for being here.